coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
There's this kind of demented sense in which not only does maintaining Biden serve the interests of the party, but America at large has been placed into a situation where the racial politics point sort of converge on as the only stable point, like having a weak white male president, like as weak as humanly possible. If you have a strong white male president, like explosions. If you have a strong non-white male president, explosions. If you have Joe Biden until he's 200 years old, then like, well, maybe we can just, 4 years at a time it. And I think that that's a fairly ludicrous hope to nurture in the bosom of one's breast. But I also think there are still large numbers of Americans who are watching all of this kind of, unfold in this agonizing way, and they probably are reasoning that we're going to have just kind of shock after shock after shock to the system. Doesn't seem like things are going to cool down or stabilize anytime soon. And so, well, at least Joe Biden is there in this sort of almost like fixed like yoga pose, just kind of, the universe is pivoting off of this nullity that has been concentrated down into human form. I do think that people are sort of catching that vibe, and they can even like joke about it, like, oh, it's like he's not even alive. But there's something deep there, and in some ways that may be like one of the bigger hurdles that Trump has to clear over the course of this campaign.
Hello, and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at the American Mind. I'm your host for today, Seth Barron, managing editor of the American Mind. I'm joined by publisher and president of the Claremont Institute, Ryan Williams, editor of the American Mind, James Boulos, and Spencer Clavin, special editor of the American Mind and associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books. Okay, well, the first son has faced the wheels of justice, and he got crushed by them. Hunter Biden went to trial for lying about his drug addiction when he filled out an application to buy a gun, a revolver, as Spencer pointed out, and I corrected him incorrectly.
Vindicated at last.
Yes. Hunter Biden was convicted in a Delaware court. A friend of mine said, this case has restored my faith in Delaware. Now he's facing a theoretically lengthy prison term. This all came about after his original favorable plea deal fell apart. He's also going to face trial for tax evasion. Now, there's a few ways to look at this. The New York Times says that this whole thing takes the wind out of Trump's fundraising sales because it proves that justice really is blind. I mean, if the president's son is convicted in federal court, how can you say that justice is rigged in favor of the current regime? Others say it's very convenient because charges against Hunter were brought up after the statute of limitations had expired on more significant crimes that would have implicated his father. What do you guys think? Is this some kind of 5D chess going on here? How is this going to impact Trump? Is it just a wash? Does anybody care? What do you guys think?
Well, I like the sort of Ben Weingarten take, at least I read it from Ben Weingarten in the New York Post, that this looks like accountability for the Bidens, but actually it's really small beer when you compare it to everything the Bidens could be held to account for. And in that sense, it is sort of this fig leaf that allows the DOJ and Merrick Garland to sort of cite, well, we can't possibly be biased because look how we've taken Hunter Biden to account. My only reticence about that is I'm not so sure there's that much planning going and coordination going on in all of this. It feels a tiny bit conspiratorial. I do think, though, that is certainly the major difference here, as often, is going to be with the coverage, right? That it's less that the DOJ is trying to maneuver itself into some perfect position, is that they don't need to, because the press is going to use this in exactly that way. And I'm already hearing that from, the left wing press, that like this renders it completely ridiculous to suggest that Trump is a victim of political persecution. And I just think, from the opposite perspective, when you consider like Trump's treatment versus Hunter's treatment and Biden's treatment, it's just plainly obvious that Trump is still being, disproportionately targeted. And also Trump is the president, the ex-president in question, and Hunter is like sort of a minor figure in the Biden pantheon. So to me, it's more about how these two trials are being spun and presented, and especially how the Trump trial is being sort of represented as a grand indictment of all things Trump, the entire Trump project, everybody who's ever voted for Trump. Whereas this Hunter situation is being presented as sort of a peripheral sideshow. There's nothing to do with Joe Biden, doesn't implicate him at all. When in fact, we know that the other stuff that Hunter's involved with, his business dealings, his associations with Ukraine and China, was in fact directly tied to Joe Biden's name, was trading on his fame and his influence, and probably, although, I guess we have to say allegedly, it did also involve him and take place with his, we know, I think, that took place with his awareness. So I guess for me, it's more about the coverage than it is about like whether the DOJ is engaging in a dance of the seven veils, which I just don't know that they're thinking that carefully or are able to coordinate that closely. Maybe I'm being naive.
Yeah, I think that all sounds about right. I mean, there's a possibility that there's a faction in the Justice Department that really wants to stick it to Biden here and see if they can somehow weaken him to a point where he could be replaced. I find that probably pretty unlikely. More likely to me is, look, the media, the regime really hate Trump because he became the biggest news story, and it's their job to be the biggest news story. Because when you're the biggest news story, when you own that story, then you are the top of the content funnel, and you control basically not just the news, what gets reported, but who talks about what gets reported and how they talk about it, and that goes on to the second and third tier commentators. And Trump's ability to seize attention is one of his greatest assets. So when you have something like Hunter Biden come along, Trump uses it obviously to his own benefit, not hard to do. Whether he's talking about the laptop or talking about the cocaine or talking about Burisma, many layers to the Hunter Biden cake. So the regime, of course, has a strong interest in taking control of the story away from him and being able to talk about Hunter in the way that they are doing, whether it's justice is served or, well, yeah, he was just kind of a fail son, and that's what we want people thinking about instead of what's going on in Ukraine. Suddenly they have all this optionality, and they're sitting there desperate to exercise it at a time when journalism is consolidating as an industry. These kinds of big stories and taking control of them becomes even more important than it already is. So that seems to me to be kind of the natural play for them. And there's all kinds of other stuff going on under the surface of Hunter Biden, whether it's Burisma, Ukraine, and other stuff that they don't want to see the light of day. They certainly don't want that to be the leading edge of the campaign. So not a huge surprise, but I do think that probably more surprises will be in store down the road.
I just want to highlight the sort of the media coverage of this in a bit more detail. So Politico's morning briefing, which if anyone has the stomach for it, I encourage them to listen to every morning. It's usually under 5 minutes, and it's a good précis on what official DC is thinking and how they're planning to talk about things. And on this topic, this morning was, and it's always hard to tell how much individual reporters imbibe this sort of narrative structure that's crafted somewhere or is a product of emergent behavior, this biological phenomenon where you don't need anyone planning everything because they're all reading from the same script, more or less. But the Politico coverage this morning was basically well, it's Biden showed his great grace under pressure and showed that he's a loving father, and also at the same time, the Biden camp doesn't think it will matter that much, which they may be right about that. It illustrates the extent to which we trust jury trials, and the Democrats trust both jury trials, the Trump one and the Hunter one, and the Republicans only trust the one that got the other guy, which has all sorts of problems, of course. Among other things, the predicate facts are seem to be wildly disparate in both cases. I mean, Hunter was clearly guilty of these things, and the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours to decide that. And the Trump thing is a farce, as we've pointed out in so many ways. The other part of it that I found interesting was this was an exchange between one of the regular hosts of the morning thing, Eugene Daniels, and one of their court reporters who's been covering the Hunter thing. And he said, I just, sorry, I know this is a lot of sort of buildup, but it's like a mixture. What do you call a mixture of a scoff and a gallows humor laugh when you hear this sort of thing? But the reporter said, well, I mean, Biden really blames himself because, he claims that if he wasn't president, then really Hunter would have gotten that plea deal and, wouldn't be facing all this stuff. When from what's been reported from people who've dug into this a bit and more honest media is the opposite is the truth. I mean, Hunter, the whole plea deal and the slow walking and the expiration of statute of limitations on a lot of this stuff was all because Biden is president and has been directing his Justice Department to either implicitly or explicitly to slow walk this and try to get a sweetheart deal. There are all sorts of internal semi-official ways to convey the sense of the president about how you should deal with this sort of thing. And the circumstantial evidence is that was going on. And from what we all know about Joe Biden's conduct in public office and his sort of serial mendaciousness over the decades, none of it is surprising. It's completely believable. And then finally, the last piece is Bloomberg had this, Bloomberg Politics. I didn't read the piece. You don't really need to read it. The headline was Hunter Biden was convicted. His dad's reaction was remarkable. And the squib in the tweet was, on one of the worst days of his life, President Biden showed the best of who he is, presenting the starkest contrast yet between him and Donald Trump. I mean, first of all, it doesn't really show better fatherhood. I mean, from what we all observe, Trump is, his kids are pretty fond of him, and he loves them, and from Barron all the way up to Eric and Don Jr. and of course Ivanka. So I don't know what their data is for that, but you can
Tiffany,
see how
and Tiffany.
And Tiffany.
I feel like Tiffany gets slighted.
No, you're right. I'm sorry, Tiffany. Thank you, Seth. So anyway, this is the talking points or the emergent behavior following predictable talking points have all gone out, and so as always, the Democratic strategic communications operation is much better, and we'll see who buys what amongst the public. Maybe it's far enough out, and the Hunter thing is enough of a distraction that it won't matter. And then the final thing from the Politico court coverage guy was, they don't think it'll matter because it's just family problems, and lots of voters know addiction and it's demons and can sympathize. And, they tried to impeach Biden on corruption, and they got absolutely no evidence that there was any corruption and special treatment for Hunter's conduct at Burisma, et cetera. So the script almost writes itself. We could have predicted it ahead of time. We'll see who's buying it amongst the voting public. And I suspect for a lot of people, it's going to be a big dust cloud that they can't really sort out. And so I don't know. It's hard to say what the net effect of these two trials and convictions on Trump and Hunter, how they'll wash out.
Yeah, I like your that was a neat way to put it all together, Ryan. I find it interesting. Just I find Hunter like psychologically just a very interesting character, and I think it's a little bit funny because in some of his emails and correspondence that were on his laptop, he talks about having to bear the burden of managing all the money and all the dirty work for his family. He's like, nobody, like, I'm the only one out there doing this. And, his father, his I guess his sister-in-law, his uncle, like they're all sort of relying, his aunt, they're all relying on him. And here's just another case where he has to do the family's dirty work, like be branded as a convicted felon and maybe go to jail, and just kind of like it's he's an interesting case, our Hunter.
Yeah, well, it's funny to compare the way that like the Biden family and the Trump family both operates, and then each one is presented as a media package. Like the story about Donald and Don Jr. and everyone else is that they represent like this sort of, I don't know, Succession style, corrupt, uber rich, like sinister band of democracy destroying schemers. And that Joe Biden is this embattled, sorrowful, beleaguered father. I mean, of course, he did have that tragedy, right, with his other son who died. And so that has been, he's sort of like keen to remind us.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I thought you were referring to the car accident.
Oh, no. This is his son died.
Oh, yeah, Bo died. Right.
Sorry. It was a revolver, Seth, a revolver. But no, like obviously there is real tragedy in the Biden family, and then that is sort of blanketed out into all the other sordid dealings. But in fact, it's possible for there to be people who suffer terrible tragedies who are also just kind of terrible people and bad politicians, and also, full of nepotism and corruption themselves, which seems to be what we have going on with Hunter Biden. Like the picture of the fail son in the era of Nepo babies. It's funny that we have all of this like talk about that phenomenon and about corruption and dark money and nepotism, and the emblem of that entire dynamic is like staring us in the face. He's the poster child for it, and would be a perfect object of some, like, you want to talk about Tom Wolfe. What would Tom Wolfe write if he were alive today? It seems like the the picaresque adventures of Hunter Biden would be like ripe fruit for him.
What cracks me up about Hunter Biden is his self-characterization as like he's just so grandiose. Like, okay, like in one of his communications, he talks about the burden of being so well endowed, of having such an enormous like long, and like how this is something that gives him a lot of like concern. But then also he talks about how his ability to find crack cocaine in any city is a superpower. Now that just cracked me up, because it's not like getting crack cocaine. Like that you don't need like some kind of super exclusive concierge membership to get like crack cocaine. I mean, crack dealers are not like discreet. It's not an exclusive thing. So
you have to get on the waiting list, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what he's talking about. It's like you go, you find whatever. I mean, you can typically figure out where to go to get crack cocaine, I guess, if you want to. In any case, I mean, maybe that sort of is all there is to say about that blip in the news cycle. Last week, the Israeli army staged a daytime raid on the Nuseirat refugee camp and freed 4 hostages taken by Hamas on October 7th. And they reportedly killed hundreds of Palestinians in the process. Israel celebrated the return of its hostages, but many have questioned its use of force, killing so many people in order to rescue just a few. Now, critics have called the action a war crime, in part because the Israeli soldiers were dressed as civilians, and you're not supposed to do that. Of course, it's illegal to take hostages, and they were being held by civilians who were working for Hamas, including, I guess, an Al Jazeera journalist. I note out of interest that Nuseirat is called a refugee camp, which implies like impoverished people living in tents. But as a function of how Palestinian refugee status works, which is that it's inherited, the camp has been around since 1948, and it's actually a built-up, well-organized neighborhood, indistinguishable from any other urban area. In fact, it's supposed to be a fairly prosperous place. In any case, the raid has renewed the charge that Israel is committing genocide. I wonder what you guys had to say about this.
I mean, sometimes online you'll get these edgy takes about how it's very feminine behavior to talk about how much you love your girlfriend or your wife. And then there's a trope where you respond by saying, like, fellas, is it gay to love a woman and care for her? And this is sort of like, fellas, is it a war crime to rescue innocent hostages who are being pressed into slavery by their enemies? Like, the reasoning here is so incredibly backwards, and a good illustration of the way in which the rhetoric of like international law and the rules of engagement in war in the 20th and 21st century can be just totally disingenuously misapplied to conflicts like the one that Israel is facing. Yeah, you're not supposed to do these sorts of things if you're engaged with a good faith adversary who has like signed up for the Geneva Conventions. But the whole problem with that mode of thinking about war is that war, by definition, sort of shatters whatever other agreements you might have reached. And like, war is the thing that happens when those sorts of agreements break down, and it's not possible to resolve disputes in pretty or genteel ways. And this idea that because Israel is effectively a Western nation that is an advanced modern nation with standards of morality, they're therefore supposed to engage with this terrorist organization as if it were like the gentlemanly warfare of European continental imperial powers, like skirmishing in the fields of Africa somewhere. Like, that's just not what's happening here. You're dealing with, as has been pointed out again and again now, an entity that uses human shields, that ensconces itself in these settlements that basically involve like freestanding structures in cities. So you're not, as you say, Seth, talking about camps of impoverished, dirt smeared, starving people. You're talking about cities where Hamas has embedded itself for the express purpose of generating in the West a narrative that Israel is like unprovoked, descending upon women and children and executing them unnecessarily en masse. And we, like patsies, like the utter dupes that we are, or at least those of us on the left that love to fall for this kind of grandstanding on the part
Spencer, I
of
think
Hamas, like we'll just
You're frozen up,
run right into
bro.
that trap. It's like Lucy with the football, like that. It's just insane to me. Anyway, to me, this is like of all the many things that are morally ambiguous and difficult and painful to deal with about the war in Israel, like this is not one of them. You rescue your hostages. It's what any nation would do in this scenario. Is the cost terrible? Yes, absolutely. Did Israel create that situation? No.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like, look, if you want to find reasons to criticize Israel's conduct of the war, you're just much better advised to look elsewhere than rescuing some hostages. I would couple tangents that are probably worth going off on. I'll try to keep it tight. One is, the rhetoric around the conduct of the war has been borderline, got to glass them all, just wipe them out. They're not just talking about Hamas, and that kind of rhetoric is unhelpful at a time when, yes, there are military objectives that are trying to be met. Yes, there's chaos in the region. Yes, this is part of broader geopolitical issues. And yes, those involve nuclear powers that are being actively provoked by the US government. So, number one, maybe cool it on the rhetoric. Number two, we're experiencing this moment here where more countries are moving in the direction of having a one party state, and there are questions that are bubbling up to the surface now about, like, well, at what point does a democracy cease to be a democracy if one party establishes sort of never ending control and start changing the underlying constitutional order, and so on and so on. And no one's questioning whether or not Israel's a democracy, but a lot of the predicaments that Israel has found itself in have had something to do with the inner workings of this kind of struggle for a certain kind of constitutional power that hadn't existed before. And when you have a political party that is pushing to really remake the constitutional order, and there's this, diminished but still in its way powerful faction that is unwilling to compromise on that issue, it creates the kind of domestic environment that really gives military action and war a kind of extra edge and extra complication. The stakes get higher, the blame game becomes more intense, and the temptation to just floor the pedal on the war and blow it up to a larger size to pull more people in, that temptation becomes more powerful. And I think we've seen all those things playing out in Israel. None of them are anywhere near over, and that's just going to continue to intensify this conflict and the stakes and the rhetoric around this conflict. And anyone who's even involved secondhand is going to find some reason or some way to try to turn the conflict to their advantage, whether it's shifting money away from BLM and dumping it into Hamas protests or rallies in the U.S. I mean, there's just all kinds of stuff. And so, it may be that we're in a situation where, not only is war ceasing to resemble skirmishers on the plains of Africa, but really it's becoming increasingly difficult in this digital age to separate out domestic conflict, domestic politics, from military conflict. Probably Clausewitz and others would say that this is nothing new, but it does seem to be headed toward a fever pitch when so much of what counts as conflict and so much of what makes the stakes high is the propaganda war, is the war of narratives and rhetoric and shaping public opinion knowingly or unknowingly.
One interesting wrinkle that I've noticed, and I had seen this before even, just to bring it back to the domestic scene, like in New York, there's constant protests. There's been since October 8th. And for a long time, there were a lot of sort of, I guess, liberal-minded, even leftist Jews who were kind of foregrounded. Lesbian rabbis, people wearing, whatever, Jews for justice in Palestine, et cetera, et cetera. They're not around anymore. You don't really see them. And it's at the same time that the movement has really escalated the intensity of its actions and its rhetoric. So, I mean, my suspicion is that behind closed doors, they're really look, I think they're fine having like these useful idiots around, as long as they're willing to co-sign the most radical Bader Meinhof style, rhetoric about destroying the West and de-Zionizing the world or whatever. But if you're like a very radical anti-Zionist Jewish person, you might not really favor rhetoric about, wiping out the entire Jewish presence from Israel. So, but anyway, this is kind of like starting to really show up on the political scene because, the other day, I guess yesterday or 2 days ago, for some reason, the anti-Zionists in New York hate the Brooklyn Museum, which is probably like the most left-wing cultural institution in the country. But so they went to the houses of all the board members and smeared paint all over the place and said, like, this person is like essentially like a child-eating Zionist, this type, and really going overboard. So, even people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's been like an extremely anti-Israel all along, she's saying like, look, this is like verging into anti-Semitism. And then the people on the hard left are like, you are worse than a fascist, because at least with a fascist, we know where we stand. So it's just kind of, as I've said before on this podcast, I'm really looking forward to the Democratic National Convention, when at least some of these folks are going to be credentialed delegates, and it's going to be a scene. I don't know how they're going to be able to keep this together, but anyway, so that's it. It's kind of interesting.
So in 1991, Harry Jaffa wrote this piece called "The Long Arm of Socialism," which we republished at the Claremont Review Books. So if you want to find it, just type Long Arm of Socialism, Jaffa, Claremont Review Books. And Jaffa ran through the collapse of the Soviet Union and the import of that. And at the end, he wrote or remarked that, racism in this is 91, so the early 90s, racism really had just become a catch-all term to describe any rhetoric or actions or whatever that deviated from the party line, which is to say the kind of left-wing establishment party line in America. And I think the same can be said of the charge of genocide against Israel by this set of folks. That is this not weird, but this nexus, which has been very observable of late, of the radical campus left, more than of late, for the last 20, 30 years, radical campus left and organizations like Hamas, which is to say, genocide is just a term now thrown around for any conduct in an armed conflict with Israel and, frankly, with the United States in which you're losing or your side is losing. So I don't think we should make too much of it. That's the real takeaway from this. And that's been evident for the last 3 months, at least, if not 5 months.
Yeah, I mean, it's fun to watch other people purity spiral, right? Like, this is my feeling about the left, and long may it last right now. I think in this one respect, conservatives should be a little bit grateful for the resilience and hashtag persistence of Joe Biden as he clings with one remaining fingernail to not just power, but existence and cogency. It definitely seems pretty clear to me, at least at this point, that it's really not as if there are all these other great options for the Democrat presidential bid waiting in the wings. And for some reason, the left has failed to elevate any of them, like Michelle Obama or Gavin Newsom or whoever. It's actually that in some respect, this Biden second term represents like a final bulwark, like a kind of dam that they're hoping will hold until the energy that Seth is talking about bursts the levees. And then it really is like all bets are off, when the Robespierre regime takes over, like you do end up in a situation where Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is saying like, no, wait, guys, like I'm one of you, I never thought that the face-eating leopards would eat me, the president of the Face-Eating Leopard Society. And they're facing that. Like they've been facing it for a while. I think they're really, really hoping it'll just keep quiet and hold off until, I guess, November. But it doesn't look like it will. And I think like that's probably on the domestic politics front, that's probably the most significant element of this, because it's not as if Israel is going to hear our press talking about how they did such a big bad by rescuing their hostages and think, okay, well, we won't rescue any more hostages. Like that, this is obviously not about anything that Israel is going to do, and it is very much about like, what is the American left? What even is the American left right now? And the answer is like, it's a giant bag of screeching cats clawing at each other while all collectively wearing a Joe Biden skin suit.
Yeah, I think Israel kind of takes a hint from Caligula, who I believe said, "Let them hate." Is that correct?
Sounds right. Yeah. Sounds
Let them hate as long as they fear. I think that's the
right.
idea. But
yes.
You know what?
Wait. Odeon's Doom Timent, I think, is, if somebody's going to correct me about that. Doom Timayont? Anyway, go on. Well, yes, I remember this now.
Well, you bring up something interesting, which is the question of Biden's viability, which seems to have been really brought into stark relief in the last week or so. First, he was in France for the the D-Day anniversary, the 80th anniversary of D-Day, where he seemed to suffer some kind of malfunction, like he was sitting down at an inopportune moment, or he sort of assumed a questionable posture, and then he and his wife like left the scene like in the middle of the present, like the whole ceremony, and then just the other day there was a Juneteenth celebration at the White House, and it was the weirdest image. You had Kamala Harris and Billy Porter, a whole bunch of people like dancing and having this great time, laughing. I guess there was some performance going on. And Biden was standing there really like in this frozen position. And it was so strange. Now, Nate Silver, like, major pollster, kind of like the voice of reason for the center left, he said, like, this is like, this just doesn't work. I mean, they have to get rid of him. They have to move him out. Now, we've talked about this on the podcast before, and our consensus has been, well, it's just too difficult to do. But surely there must be people. I mean, given the poll numbers, given everything, there must be people in the administration and in Kalorama and so forth, like thinking like, okay, we've got to this is really bad. I mean, does it really all come down to just like, well, Joe Biden wants him to be president again?
Well, one potentially skillful maneuver is, if we're right that the convention is going to be such a shit show, then you could use that as sort of a last minute 11th hour opportunity or occasion or pretext to say, unfortunately, the wheels have just come off the Biden train. And yeah, I can see some people you would replace him with. I mentioned Michelle Obama, I mentioned Gavin Newsom, but there was also this like big Wall Street Journal piece that caused kind of a micro drama in the sorts of circles we move in, where they basically ran a bunch of quotes from some Republicans, mostly Republicans, but some non-Republicans, saying he's totally lost it. This is a disaster. Nobody really knows like what to do with Biden and his deterioration. And then there were also in that piece, like Democrats quoted who had to call back a second time because they had insufficiently enthused about Biden's energetic powers. Like they said something sort of lukewarm the first time, and then the White House obviously leaned on them, and they returned to just emphasize that really he is doing backflips like behind closed doors. And it's so transparently false. And as you say, Seth, these clips, I mean, some of them are selectively edited or whatever, but not all of them. And the ones that are selectively edited aren't conveying anything worse than the accurate ones are conveying. Like this, it's obvious at this point, the accumulation of that evidence is such that, he is obviously suffering. And I don't know. To me, I just keep coming back to like, my take is actually not that it's too difficult to take him out, but that it really is the best of bad options. Like this was an exchange that Mary Harrington and Patrick Deneen had on Twitter, where Harrington was like, this cannot go on. Can it possibly? And Deneen was like, no, like for non-Americans, it's difficult to understand that this serves the interest of the Democrat Party perfectly. Like to have this like effectively vegetable non-entity in the position of power makes it possible then to run via faceless bureaucracy. And that's the best we can hope for when the alternatives are both more energetic and also therefore more volatile and more keyed into whatever youthful energy is going to come roaring out of the gates when the levees break.
Yeah, I'll just note though, Seth, that 538 yesterday published, if they ran their forecast model, and they had Biden winning the election 53 times out of 100 and Trump winning it 47 times out of 100, with Biden losing Arizona, Nevada, and Georgia, but winning Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. So I that to me confirms what I said months ago, which is maybe just 1 or 2 months ago, which is this all looks to be playing out just like 2020 did. Mm-hmm. Although Biden has lower poll numbers, it's looking remarkably similar. I don't know about the timeline precisely, but so I still I still think Trump's chances are a toss-up, and 538 seems to agree.
Yeah, there's this kind of demented sense in which not only does maintaining Biden serve the interests of the party, but America at large has been placed into a situation where the racial politics point sort of converge on as the only stable point, like having a weak white male president, like as weak as humanly possible. If you have a strong white male president, like explosions. If you have a strong non-white male president, explosions. If you have Joe Biden until he's 200 years old, then like, well, maybe we can just, 4 years at a time it. And I think that that's a fairly ludicrous hope to nurture in the bosom of one's breast. But I also think there are still large numbers of Americans who are watching all of this kind of unfold in this agonizing way, and they probably are reasoning that we're going to have just kind of shock after shock after shock to the system. Doesn't seem like things are going to cool down or stabilize anytime soon. And so, well, at least Joe Biden is there in this sort of almost like fixed like yoga pose, just kind of the universe is pivoting off of this nullity that has been concentrated down into human form. I do think that people are sort of catching that vibe, and they can even like joke about it, like, oh, it's like he's not even alive. But there's something deep there, and in some ways that may be like one of the bigger hurdles that Trump has to clear over the course of this campaign.
So like Joe Biden represents like the Shiva consciousness, just like this one singular point around which
at the still point of the turning world, right? That's the Elliott line. That's like Joe Biden at the still point of the turning world. I love it.
Amazing. Yeah, I just want to say regarding the polls, I mean, it does come all down to Pennsylvania, but I think there is a way in which even if the Democrats win Pennsylvania and the Republicans win Arizona, Nevada, and Georgia, if the Republicans can flip Omaha, like that one vote in Omaha, then it's tied. And then it'll go to the House. So
are you saying they have to storm Omaha Beach, Seth?
Well, maybe in a way. But, shifting our view from the American political scene, the European elections this week were a stunning victory for the conservatives of Europe and really shocked the left establishment. Emmanuel Macron has called for a snap election in France. The foreign minister of France, Stéphane Séjourné, said, the result is a lightning bolt in political life. We must take that into account. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban said that Europe's political landscape has shifted to the right and towards peace. I don't know about that. Yolanda Diaz, the labor minister of Spain and one of the country's 3 deputy prime ministers, announced she's stepping down as leader of the left-wing Sumar alliance following its disappointing results on Sunday. We saw similar results in Italy and Germany. So what do you guys think? What do we make of these results? Is this just, pendulum oscillation or something deeper?
I mean, I find this all weirdly fascinating. I don't have a good answer to your question, Seth, but there are some data points that are useful and interesting, and I'm sure that Ryan and James will have like deeper history on European continental politics than I. But one thing that's worth noting is the whole question about whether this represents a victory for populist politics or just kind of the incorporation of populist politics into run-of-the-mill back and forth politicking, which in turn will be just subsumed into the bureaucratic Euro state, right? Because I think we're really talking here about like the 3 big continental countries. We're talking about France, Germany, and Italy. And there are these 3 parties in those places. Let's see if I can get this right. It's the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland in Germany. It's the Fratelli d'Italia, which is the Giorgia Meloni party in Italy. And then it's the kind of rebranded Front National, which has now become the Rassemblement National with Marine Le Pen, and then this young gun, like Jordan Bardella, I think is his name. And so those countries have now had victories in this EU parliament for their populist parties, but also their populist parties, notably Maloney's, have been kind of domesticated. Like a lot of people are pretty dissatisfied with Maloney for not really being as aggressive about immigration as she said she was going to be, and a whole bunch of other things. She's been kind of bullish on family issues, but less so on some of the other like populist right wing movements. And then in other countries, like in Poland, people are kind of moving away from populist right wing stuff into more like recognizable center right wing stuff. To me, and this is like probably a smooth brain take, but like this is all about immigration. Like the entire thing is just about the the hangover of Wir schaffen das, which was Angela Merkel's like, let everybody in. It won't matter. We can absorb as many people from as many countries as we need to, or as want to come here. And in fact, they have a right to be here, and we welcome you. You know, like, and so now you're in this situation which is analogous to the one that America may find itself in, or perhaps some would argue is already in, where inertia would dictate just basically ceasing to become a country. But the alternatives are all like really unpalatable, even to the people who want to solve the problem, because mass deportations are really ugly. And like in France, they seem to be floating things that are like even more intense. Like they're talking about preferential treatment for like French citizens only, which again seems pretty reasonable. It sounds a lot like what Steve Saylor talks about when he talks about citizenism. You know, they're kind of trying to implement that, but like the apparatus for that is just kind of gone. And so the arc of every populist movement bends toward cringe somehow. So I don't know. It does strike me as a significant result, but not in the sense that I think now Europe is going to like rise again so much as like the European machine that has been put in place is capable of absorbing an enormous amount of political energy and neutralizing it, which makes me a little antsy about like how the Europeans would pursue the solutions that their people seem increasingly to want.
Yeah, it was reported today that Germany's official class or the policy people said, you know, well, it would take us 80 years to deport 50,000 people, and in the meantime, millions more would come. So you can begin to see the ways in which the desires of the populace will be frustrated. I would encourage everyone to listen to Steve Hayward's interview with John O'Sullivan on the Powerline podcast. John's been a longtime observer, has lived in Hungary now for maybe a decade, but has been a long time, that is 6 decades now, observer of European politics. And they sort of cover the scene from the imminent collapse of the Tory party in the UK to the developments in Germany and elsewhere. So I just commend it to everyone's attention.
Another thing we should mention is that England is going in the opposite. It seems like it's about to go in the opposite direction here, right? Rishi Sunak has called an election. It's happening on July 4th, which is hilarious. And it looks like, you know, the Tories are going to get kicked out of power. Yeah, like, oh, and one other data point also that we didn't mention is this German meme that's been going around, Ausländer raus, which is a song about like foreigners get out, Germany for Germans, and you're seeing videos of people breaking spontaneously into this song at like youth rallies. And it's like
in nightclubs,
right? And then when you combine this with the fact that, like strictly speaking, a lot of the policies that these continental populist parties want are like kind of national socialism. Like they want strong government involvement, but like, you know, benefits for citizens and, you know, preferential treatment and all this stuff. You know, this is in no way saying like they're literally Hitler, but it is sort of saying it, to me, it all falls into the bucket of like, well, what did you expect? Which is an increasingly large bucket that, you know, if you just tell an entire ancient people that they have no right to exist and like should probably just be replaced, you know, at a certain point, if you delegitimize and exclude all like moderate political options that would sort of moderate that position, eventually you're going to end up with more radical and unwieldy and volatile ones. And like that, it doesn't fill me with any glee or peace of mind. But I'm also not like, how could they ever have come to these conclusions?
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting that the Germans said, oh, well, it would take 80 years to deport 50,000 people. So just put that out of your mind. I mean, all that means is that given the existing rules and court standards for how you deport someone with like, some endless series of appeals and all of that, that makes it difficult to do.
Right.
But one can imagine a faction rising up that says, well, maybe we'll just dispense with that, with your ideas of due process. And I guess that's it seems to me like, well, there's two possible futures. One, Germany continues to, the continent continues to admit lots of people from Africa and, Central Asia or wherever, an infinite number of them, or, semi-infinite as far as like, the boundaries of a country go, and they just learn to deal with it. Or there's this other option, which, doesn't really sound very pleasant, but it also seems kind of like inescapable to think that it's not going to rise. I'm not saying it's going to win, but yeah, it's a very very puzzling times over there, and I guess over here too. Although I mean, to me, it sort of seems like, well, maybe what's happening is Europe will become Africa, and United States, North America will just become like, like a Latino country. Brazil, sort of, yeah, but like a more kind of Latinized than Brazil, maybe, Yeah, I mean, essentially something along those lines. It seems like that's the future, and maybe Russia will become Chinese. I don't know.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, come on, guys. This is all just growing pains in the path to the single world state. So
sure.
just wait a few generations, and we'll all be living in a pool queue.
No, it's going to be
Um,
great.
yeah, I don't know. You look at Germany, you look at all this going on, yeah, efforts at the far right, whatever. I mean, it's all very late. It's extremely late in the game here, and that's without even introducing religious questions into this whole schema, which are a huge part of the way things are going to shake out. I would say so. It's not like the old days where you could comfortably embrace kind of robust European nationalism and not worry that it would go off the rails because I mean, especially in Germany, it was a Christian democracy. It was Helmut Kohl. It was like very non-threatening, and it worked for a while. And then it was decided that Helmut Kohl was emblematic of racism and patriarchy and whatever, and you had to bring in the Turks and some other people, and it's not shocking to see that the mix is a volatile one, whether because of the influx of Islam into places where Islam never had remotely a majority or even that much of an influence, or whether because of the fade out of Christianity in these European countries. And when you have both of those religious dynamics taking place at the same time, it's going to be a hot one way or the other, and it's hard to see how to keep it relatively cooler. It seems like the Biden administration's approach is, well, we'll just kind of like slowly impoverish Europe, and maybe that way everyone will be too worried about staying warm in the winter to engage in running street battles. But even that seems to me to be quite naive. If they think that's the last tool that's left in the tool shed, then maybe they're even more pessimistic than we are.
Wow. Well, looks like we're kind of drawing to a close on a really cheery note. But before we completely close, let's let's move to the segment of the hour where we talk about our favorite pieces from the website and cheer everybody up. This is when we encourage our listeners to go to americanmind.org and read the damn site. So Ryan, what did What item did you like the most? Would you recommend?
Yeah, I have. I like how Spencer's title changes every week that we host. He's special editor now. He was editor at large before.
Special editor is great because it sounds like I'm riding the special bus, which
I
is
was
really
just going to say
appropriate.
it's like a short bus joke. No, decidedly not a short bus resident is Spencer. I would just want to recommend his essay called A Matter of Taste, the subhead of which is Conservatives Must Snub Political Kitsch for Aesthetic Greatness. And Spencer makes a cogent and learned case for making great art and cultivating a taste for great art on the right, because it's if we don't do that, there's going to be few ways out of our current malaise. This is just one aspect of that. And he cites an essay that our own Mike Anton wrote in May of 2022, which I would just recommend everyone if they haven't read it, called The Tom Wolfe Model, Why the Career of Tom Wolfe Should Serve as a Lesson for Conservative Donors and Young Writers. Mike wrote it for a friendly site, I am 1776. So check out Spencer's argument, follow his links. And one more plug, a book that came out by a friend of Claremont and sometimes CRB essayist, Michael Walsh, who spent many years as a journalist, but also knows his classical music well and plays it himself. This book called The Fiery Angel. And one of Michael Walsh's points was that, good art, including good political art, is not political for its own sake. It concentrates first on being beautiful and good, and as a matter of course, conveys salutary political messages. So the right's getting slightly better at that at the margins, but they have a lot of work to do. And Spencer's essay is a good primer on why they should do it.
Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, that was a great essay, and it's the one that I was going to cite. But
I got to go first. I stole it from you, Seth.
Yeah, Spencer, what do you think? And you're not allowed to cite your own essay.
Oh, damn it! I'm sorry. I need more time. No, thank you guys. I'm blushing, and yeah, that Anton piece is really excellent as well. Speaking of Tom Wolfe, so yeah, I have a piece that can perhaps cheer us up, as Seth invited us to do, and that's Holy Living by Auguste Meyrot. It's on a subject that has interested me as well, and that's celebrity conversions, especially that of Russell Brand, who features in the main image, but also talking about Ayaan Hirsi Ali and a few others who have really been kind of in the news for their conversion to Christianity. This is a difficult issue to navigate because it's hard to know, especially early on, how to treat high profile conversions. On the one hand, they have the potential to move the needle on the public perception of Christianity, and people like Brand and Ali, who have big followings, command a lot of attention. For them to just represent Christianity as something that not only like weird outcasts believe in can be definitely viable. On the other hand, any new conversion, and especially one by someone so volatile and weird as a celebrity, like say Russell Brand, poses real challenges if you get on board that train and then suddenly they'll disappoint you and you'll get burned, because in the next 5 minutes they'll decide it's not Christianity but like a fifth marriage that they need or something. So Meyrot deals with this, I think, really nicely by just saying, without leaping to congratulate these particular celebrities because they're celebrities, but also without like gatekeeping or sniffing at them because they're too weird and offbeat. Maybe instead we should regard this as like a sort of interesting statement about the Christian church, and especially the Catholic Church, that this is where these like contentious misfits seem to be gravitating in a moment of increasing ideological rigor mortis and lockdown. I think that's an interesting angle, and I just think that in general these phenomena like bear more attention than they've gotten. So check out Holy Living by Auguste Meyrot.
Great. James, how about you?
Well, I don't know if this is going to cheer anyone up, but I am curious what people think about this one. I really enjoyed a lot of this piece. At the end, it went in a direction that I would not have gone in, and I think it's sort of an interesting debate on the right that I'm curious to sort of take people's temperature on. So it's called "How to Defeat the CCP" by James Fennell and Bradley Thayer. And the subhead really says it all. Embracing communist China was the U.S.'s greatest strategic failure. Strong agree. I'm one of these guys who thinks that it's more important that we focus our energies on the problems that China is causing for us than the problems that Russia is causing for us. And the piece does a very good job of just kind of going blow by blow and pointing out the moments, these pivotal moments where the U.S. strategic concept on China took us in a direction that I think has proven to be, let's just say, highly unsatisfactory. I am old enough to remember when Donald Trump was the only person who was saying, "Wait a minute, maybe our relationship with China is foobarred, and we should do something about that." Now it's just kind of the conventional wisdom, at least on the surface. I think there's still a strong faction in the regime that still very much just wants to. To merge the U.S. with China. You can't really have globalization unless you have the U.S. and China kind of forming some sort of blob together. But the end of the piece says, and so therefore we need to reverse all of these strategic blunders and defeat the Communist Party of China. And it's I guess there's this feeling that even if we kind of can't do that, we should talk as if we can, and maybe we can meme it into existence. And the meme for me is like, one does not simply defeat the Communist Party of China. Certainly not without the kind of global conflict that I think, certainly in its current state, the American people will not benefit from. The kind of conflagration it would take to win a head-to-head full-blown fight with China. I don't think America's ready for that, and I don't think Americans are either. And even so, even if we are championing at the bit for that, seems like a very tough nut to crack. So, my attack would be to agree that all of the blunders were blunders, that we're in a terrible position, and that we need to figure out, how to respond to that and what to do about that. But I do think we just, it's going to help us, not hurt us, to be a little more realistic about what the end game looks like. But that's just my opinion. So I'm curious to hear what others think about it, and that's my rec.
Even though it's just your opinion, I would say that your opinion holds a lot of water in these circles. So I will confirm your strong opinion of that article. It was very good. I'm going to refer to Israel's Bad Month by Kenan Spivak, who wrote this is the second part of his concerning his trip to Israel and his discussions with high-ranking people there. But this article focuses on the international organizations that have condemned Israel and, to one extent or another, threatened to, punish it, namely the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. Spivak goes through and shows the ways in which these are hypocritical decisions. They're not really based in the reality of the situation. They're partisan, and that these organizations are flawed to begin with. In any case, it's a very interesting article. It goes over everything very in great depth and very specifically. So Israel's Bad Month by Kenan Spivak. Well, that's about all the time we have for this week. If you want to know more about everything we do, you can go to AmericanMind.org. If you'd like to support our work, you can click the support tab at the top of the page. We deeply appreciate the donations that fund what we do. You can leave a 5-star review for us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Subscribe to our podcast. Spread the good news by tweeting about us, telling your friends, posting our items on social media. We appreciate all the support we get, and it's thanks to you and because of you that we do what we do. Thanks to our production crew, Jake Gannon and Logan Zeppieri, and thanks to everyone listening. Until next week, American Mind podcast signing off.